They said the escape pod launched empty, but Lieutenant Soren Hale would spend the rest of his life wishing that had been true. Because when Pod 7 tore free from Dock Ring C and vanished into the black beyond Talon Station, it carried one dying secret, one living witness, and the last proof that a human being had stayed behind when every law of survival said he should have run. Lyra Vale felt the launch before she heard it. The pod shuddered once, hard enough to rattle her teeth, then shot forward with a clean mechanical force that pressed her into the crash webbing. Frost feathered across the lower edge of the glass. Warning icons flashed in amber over the curved interior. Oxygen stable. Guidance partial. External integrity compromised. None of it mattered. Her palm slammed against the viewport anyway, leaving a streak of blue across the clear surface as Talon Station drifted backward into view, immense and wounded, its outer ring glowing with strips of emergency light that blinked against the dark like a heartbeat refusing to quit. Somewhere inside that failing metal skeleton, Ethan Cross was still alive. At least for a few more seconds. At least that was what her mind kept saying, even while another part of her knew the math better than hope ever could. Talon Station had been built 42 years earlier as a fuel relay and long-range listening post at the edge of mapped Union space, a place where cargo crews drank burnt coffee, navigators checked star charts, and forgotten contractors kept old systems breathing with tape, patience, and profanity. Ethan belonged to that last group. He was not a soldier. Not a diplomat. Not one of the polished names discussed in council halls under soft gold light. He was a human maintenance specialist from Cedar Falls, Iowa, 6 feet tall in his station boots, broad-shouldered, pale-skinned, and usually carrying a toolkit that looked heavier than common sense. He fixed doors that jammed, filters that coughed, circuits that other people stopped believing in. He had grease under his nails more often than not. And less than 11 minutes earlier, he had been on the lowest mechanical deck, muttering at a failed pressure relay while the station around him began to die. Lyra shut her eyes, but memory came anyway. She could still hear the sound the station made when the first impact rolled. Through it, not an explosion exactly, but a deep metallic groan, like the whole structure had been struck by a giant tuning fork. Lights had flickered. Gravity had trembled. Somewhere far off, steel screamed against steel. Then came the alarms, layered one over another, each one calmer than the reality beneath it. She had fallen in the smoke and static of Dock Ring C, one leg numb, one shoulder burning with cold that felt sharper than heat. Her guards were gone. The corridor doors had sealed. The men hunting her were close. And then, through red emergency light and drifting vapor, she had heard footsteps that did not belong to any warrior she knew. Slow at first. Uneven. Human. Ethan had appeared through the haze with a flashlight clipped to his vest and a wrench still hanging from one hand, as if he had walked into the end of the world by accident and had simply decided to keep going. He looked at her once, took in the blood on the floor, the ruined paneling, the insignia half-burned from her collar, and said the strangest thing anyone had ever said to her in a moment like that. "Well," he murmured, breathing hard as the deck shook under his boots, "that's not good." And for one impossible second, with the stars outside watching in perfect silence, Lyra Vale forgot the pain. He should have left the moment he saw her. Any reasonable man would have. The deck around Ethan Cross was already listing 3 degrees to port, enough to make loose bolts roll in thin silver lines across the grated floor, and every few seconds the lights dimmed so low that the whole corridor seemed to vanish before coming back in a hard red pulse. Talon Station was not failing all at once. It was failing one tired system at a time, like an old ship trying to remember which part of itself mattered most. Ethan knew the sound of a dying station. He had heard it in air scrubbers that coughed before they quit, in coolant pumps that whined too high, in doors that took half a second too long to answer a command. This was the same song, just bigger. Colder. Final. Lyra tried to push herself upright when he reached her, and that alone told him more than any uniform could. Most people in pain looked for help. She looked offended by the need for it. Her skin carried a deep blue sheen beneath the flashing emergency lights, not flat like paint but luminous in a way that made the air around her seem sharper. Her dark uniform had been cut across one shoulder where a seal had split, and one long panel of silver trim hung loose near her collarbone. There was dust on her cheek, and something in her expression that reminded Ethan of polished glass under stress. Beautiful, maybe, in the distant way starlight was beautiful. Dangerous too. "Do not touch me," she said, the words precise even with her breathing unsteady. Ethan crouched anyway and set his wrench down beside his boot. "That is usually how rescue works," he said. She looked at him then, really looked, as though deciding whether he was stupid, brave, or some human mixture of both. The station groaned again. A shower of sparks hissed down from a split conduit 10 feet away, bright for a second, then gone. Ethan glanced up by instinct, already counting hazards, pressure seams, support load, fire risk. Old habit. He unlatched the compact scanner from his belt, ran it once across her side, and read the crude data through a cracked screen. Elevated stress markers. Suit pressure unstable. Left leg impaired. "Can you stand?" he asked. "That depends," Lyra said quietly. "Will you obey the first intelligent thing I have told you and run?" Ethan almost smiled, but not quite. There was a tremor in the deck now, smaller and more frequent. Somewhere behind the sealed bulkhead to his left, something heavy struck metal with enough force to ring through the wall. He did not know who had been chasing her, only that anyone worth this much trouble was not someone you left in a hallway to die alone. Not if you still had hands to help with. "I can get maintenance lift 12 running," he said, more to himself than to her. "If the backup relay is still alive, it will take us 2 levels up to the dock corridor. From there maybe we can find a pod that has not already been fried." Lyra gave a faint, disbelieving laugh that carried no humor in it. "You say that as if there is still a path out." "There is always a path out," Ethan said. "It just gets ugly near the end." He slid one arm carefully behind her back and offered his other hand. For a second she did not take it. Her eyes moved over his face, his grease-stained sleeve, the station badge half peeled from his chest plate, as if the plainness of him made no sense. Human. White-skinned. Tired. A contractor from a world her people barely bothered naming in formal rooms. And still he stayed. Still he waited for her answer. When she finally placed her hand in his, her fingers were colder than the metal rail beside them. Ethan pulled her gently to her feet, felt her stumble once, then catch herself with stubborn dignity. The corridor alarm shifted tones overhead. Dock ring containment had been compromised. 90 seconds, maybe less, before the next seal dropped. Ethan grabbed his wrench, tightened his grip around her forearm, and started guiding her toward the smoke ahead. Behind them, the darkness deepened. Ahead of them, Talon Station kept breaking apart one warning light at a time. The first door did not open when Ethan hit the panel. It only flashed a stubborn orange line across the cracked screen and gave him the same flat refusal every station mechanic learned to hate. Access delayed. System rerouting. He exhaled through his nose, shifted Lyra gently against the wall brace beside him, and popped the maintenance cover off with 2 sharp turns of his wrench. Warm air breathed from the panel in short uneven bursts, carrying the smell of dust, scorched insulation, and old metal that had been heated one time too many. "You are smiling," Lyra said, watching him through the red pulse of emergency light. Ethan glanced up. "No, I am not. A little. That is not smiling. That is me being offended by bad wiring." Her mouth moved, just barely. Not quite amusement. Not yet. But something in her face had loosened since the corridor. Something small. Human enough that it startled him. He pulled 2 fiber leads apart, bypassed the relay with a stripped contact pin from his kit, and the door finally gave a tired mechanical sigh before splitting down the center. Beyond it, Service Spine 12 stretched long and narrow through the middle of the station like the inside of a giant machine. White vapor drifted low across the deck from a ruptured coolant line farther down. Overhead, emergency strips flashed in red and pale gold, alternating. Just slowly enough to make the shadows move. Ethan eased Lyra forward. Her weight leaned into him more now, not because she trusted him, he figured, but because pain had its own authority. Her left step lagged. Her breathing stayed measured, though he could hear the strain beneath it. She was the kind of person who would rather break than let anyone hear her cracking. "You have done this before," she said after 20 feet. "Carried injured aliens through collapsing stations?" Ethan asked. "No. Yelled at old equipment like it insulted your family." He snorted softly. "My dad fixed grain dryers and truck engines. I grew up in garages and machine sheds. Things break. You keep them going anyway." Lyra looked at him sideways. "Why?" The question landed strangely in the middle of all that noise. Ethan stepped over a loose conduit, guided her around a patch of ice forming on the deck, and answered without thinking too hard about it. "Because somebody has to." She was quiet after that. Ahead, the service spine opened into a vertical transfer shaft where maintenance lift 12 hung motionless between decks. Its call lights were dead. The safety rails along the edge had warped inward from a previous heat surge, leaving the whole platform looking tired and vaguely offended by its own existence. Ethan leaned Lyra against the bulkhead and peered down. The shaft vanished into darkness below, 100 feet of cable, ladder rungs, and steel. Above them, somewhere 2 levels up, was Dock Corridor C and whatever pod systems had not already gone cold. He checked the lift housing, found a manual override wheel, and muttered something under his breath that Lyra did not understand but recognized on tone alone as deeply unflattering to the manufacturer. "This route is too slow," she said. "There will be others." There were others, Ethan corrected, bracing both hands on the override wheel. "Now there is this." The wheel resisted at first, then jerked half an inch and began to turn with a shriek that echoed up the shaft. Ethan put his shoulder into it. The tendons in his forearm stood out under the grime on his skin. The lift shuddered above them, then started lowering in short uneven drops. Lyra watched him in silence. For the first time since he had found her, her expression changed from guarded disdain to something harder to name. Not softness. Not surrender. Recognition, maybe. As if she had spent her life among people who moved for rank, fear, or glory and was only now meeting a man powered by something simpler and more dangerous. Ethan stopped turning long enough to catch his breath. A strand of hair had fallen across his forehead. Sweat traced down beside his temple despite the cold air. "When we get up there," he said, still facing the wheel, "you tell me which dock gives us the best shot. No speeches. No secrets. Just the fastest way out." Lyra looked at the floor for 1 second, then back at him. The gold pulse of the warning lights caught the silver pattern at her collar, half hidden beneath dust and damage. "If I tell you who I am," she said quietly, "you may decide to leave me here after all." Ethan gave the wheel another hard turn. Metal screamed. The lift dropped another 3 feet. He did not look at her when he answered. "Lady, I found you here and I stayed. Whatever your name is, you are late if you think that is the part that scares me." Somewhere far behind them, deep in the station, a sealed door slammed open with a sound too distant to identify and too deliberate to ignore. Ethan heard it. Lyra heard it too. Their eyes met for half a second. Then the lift finally clanged into place, and the station seemed to hold its breath with them. Trust did not arrive all at once. It came in pieces, the way light came through the damaged lift cage as it climbed past broken deck markers and half-dead service panels. 1 floor. Then another. The motor above them caught, slipped, then caught again with a grinding shiver that vibrated through the handrails and into Ethan's palms. He stood between Lyra and the open side of the lift without seeming to think about it, one hand on the warped rail, the other braced near the control housing where he could reach the emergency stop if the whole platform decided it had suffered enough. The shaft smelled like coolant, hot dust, and old grease baked into steel. Somewhere far below, something heavy settled with a low metallic thud that rolled upward through the frame. Lyra kept her weight off her injured leg as well as she could, but each rise of the platform took a little more color from her face. Ethan noticed. He noticed everything mechanical, and right now she had become part of the machinery he was trying to keep from failing. When the lift reached dock access level C, the gate did not open on its own. Of course it did not. Ethan leaned past the panel, popped the housing with the tip of his wrench, and blew a loose strand of hair from his eyes while red light flashed across the grease on his knuckles. "Tell me your station designers hated maintenance crews," he muttered, "without telling me your station designers hated maintenance crews." Lyra watched him work in silence for a moment before she said, "This station was union-built. Your species takes pride in impossible systems." "That is because impossible systems make job security," Ethan said. He bridged two contacts with the back of a stripped fuse and the gate slid open 6 inches, paused, then dragged the rest of the way with all the grace of a barn door in winter. Cold air rushed in from the dock corridor. It hit them with the sharp clean smell of vented oxygen and open space somewhere beyond the sealed blast shutters. The corridor itself was wider than the service spine below, lined with cargo rails, wall lockers, and emergency guidance lights running in pale blue arrows toward the pod bay. One whole section of ceiling had come down at an angle, spilling insulation and silver conduit like the bones of the station had pushed through its skin. Ethan stepped out first, scanned left and right, then turned back and offered Lyra his hand again. This time she took it without argument. Her fingers closed around his wrist instead of his palm, firm despite the tremor he could feel there. They moved together down the corridor, slower now but steadier. The floor vibrated beneath their boots in irregular pulses. Not impacts. Not exactly. More like distant docking clamps cycling under too much load. Ethan did not like the sound. He liked even less the silence between alarms, those little blank spaces when a place seemed to forget how to pretend it was still in control. "How far?" he asked. 300 feet, Lyra said. "Then a right turn into Bay 9. And the best pod?" "There is no best pod," she said. "Only one with a chance." Ethan gave that a quick nod, like a man accepting weather he could not negotiate with. They passed a wall of observation glass on their left, spiderwebbed with cracks but still holding. Beyond it, stars burned in impossible numbers, cold and steady, indifferent to failing bulkheads and breath and pain and fear. Ethan glanced at them once, then back to the path ahead. Lyra noticed that too. Most beings looked at the stars as if asking permission from something older than themselves. Ethan looked at them the way he looked at schematics, as if they were real and beautiful and not particularly interested in saving anybody. The thought should have made him seem smaller. Somehow it did not. At the next junction he stopped so fast Lyra nearly stepped into him. A thin line of white vapor drifted across the floor from Bay 9. The blast door there had not closed all the way. It was hung open by maybe 14 inches, just enough to show darkness inside and the occasional amber blink of a surviving console. Ethan lowered his voice without meaning to. "You said one pod with a chance." Lyra's eyes fixed on that narrow gap. For the first time since he found her, genuine worry moved openly across her face. "Yes," she said. "And if that door is open, then someone reached it before we did. Some truths arrived with sirens. Others slipped out in whispers while the station came apart around them." Ethan did not move toward the half-open bay door right away. He shifted Lyra back into the shadow of a wall support, lowered himself just enough to see through the narrow opening, and listened. The dock bay beyond was too quiet. Not empty. Quiet. There was a difference. Empty had a certain hollowness to it, a clean echo. This silence felt occupied, as if the room were holding itself still on purpose. A single indicator panel blinked near the far wall in a tired amber rhythm. One of the escape pod cradles still had power. That much was real. The rest of the bay sat in darkness broken only by spill light from the corridor and the cold pale shine of stars filtering through the armored viewport on the far side. "Can you tell how many?" Ethan asked, barely above a breath. Lyra's eyes narrowed, her hearing clearly better than his. She stayed still for 3 long seconds. "No voices," she said. "No movement. That is not the same as safe." "I am aware." Ethan glanced at her, then back to the opening. There was strain in her face now that she could not hide, the fine kind that settled around the eyes and mouth when a body had gone past endurance and was living on discipline alone. He had seen farmers push through 16-hour harvest days with that same look. Men with cracked hands and bad backs who still climbed into the cab before dawn because corn did not care if you were tired. He had never expected to see the expression on a blue-skinned alien aristocrat in a broken station at the edge of Union space, but the universe had always shown a mean streak for irony. "Stay here," he said. "I mean it." Lyra straightened a fraction, insult rising on instinct. "And if I refuse?" Ethan gave her the quickest look, weary and dry and somehow steady in all that red light. "Then refuse after I check whether Bay 9 is planning to kill us." For the first time, the answer he drew from her was not cold. It was almost reluctant. "Very well." Ethan slipped through the gap sideways, one hand on the frame, the other holding his wrench low at his thigh because it was still the only thing in his grip that felt honest. The air inside the bay was 10 degrees colder than the corridor. He felt it immediately across the sweat at the back of his neck. The pod cradle nearest the launch rail stood open, empty except for restraints dangling loose and one overhead monitor flickering with corrupted telemetry. No signs of launch. No scorch pattern. No recent cycle. Good. Maybe. He moved 2 steps farther in, boots quiet on the deck plating, and saw what had forced the outer bay door to remain partly open. A cargo case had slammed into the track during the last tremor, wedging the blast door before it could seal. The station had not been careless. It had simply run out of luck. "What do you see?" Lyra called softly from the corridor. Ethan let out a measured breath. "A pod. 1 pod. Maybe functional." Door jammed by debris. He crossed to the nearest console and wiped a layer of condensation from the glass with his sleeve. The screen struggled. Blinked, then gave him a scatter of system checks in 3 languages, one of them human, one of them trade standard, and one he did not know but guessed belonged to Lyra's people from the elegant vertical script. Pod 7. Fuel reserve at 48%. Guidance array degraded but responsive. Life support nominal for short-range emergency transit. Good enough to call hope if you were desperate. He was definitely desperate. "Lyra," he said, still studying the screen, "you told me there was one with a chance. How did you know it was this one?" There was a pause behind him, barely long enough to matter and somehow long enough to matter completely. When she answered, her voice had changed. It had gone quieter, but not weaker. Formal. The sound of someone stepping into a truth she had been avoiding. "Because that pod was keyed to diplomatic command authority," she said. "And because I am the only surviving holder of that authority on this station." Ethan turned slowly. Lyra stood in the narrow opening, one hand braced on the bent edge of the blast door, pale blue light from the console touching the silver pattern at her collar. Now that he saw it clearly, the insignia was not decorative trim at all. It was rank. Old rank. The kind people built wars around. "You are not a courier," he said. "No," Lyra replied. There was no pride in it now. Only weight. "I am Lyra Vale of the House of Vale, sworn heir to the Accord line." The station hummed around them, brittle and fading. Somewhere deep in the hull, another alarm came alive and then died halfway through its own warning. Ethan looked at her for one long second, taking in the exhaustion in her face, the blood on her sleeve, the impossible scale of the name she had just handed him. Then he nodded once and turned back to the console. "All right," he said. "That sounds expensive. Let us get you out of here." And in the silence that followed, Lyra Vale understood something that unsettled her more than the failing station ever could. Ethan Cross had just learned that saving her might change the fate of worlds. It did not make him hesitate. It did not make him kneel. It did not make him afraid. It only made him work faster. The station had not been attacked for fuel, territory, or salvage. Ethan understood that much the moment the pod console finished clearing its error stack and opened a protected diplomatic channel he had no business seeing. The screen flickered twice, then resolved into a sealed transit header with 3 lines of authorization, a biometric crest, and a message tag marked Priority Sovereign Class. Even without reading the script, he knew what that meant. Whoever had come for Lyra had not come to steal a ship. They had come to make sure this message never reached open space. He leaned closer, one hand braced on the edge of the console while the amber display painted the grease on his knuckles gold. "That looks bad," he said quietly. Lyra stepped beside him, favoring her left leg but standing on her own now. "It is worse than bad," she answered. "It is proof." Her reflection hovered faintly in the dark glass beyond the text, blue skin, silver insignia, tired eyes that had seen too much in too little time. Ethan tapped the lower corner of the display and brought up the transmission manifest. 7 encrypted records. 1 diplomatic testimony. 1 genetic seal file tied to the Accord line. 3 council routing addresses. His stomach tightened. He did not know the politics of alien houses, but he knew enough about secrets to recognize one that could set fire to half the map. "Talk to me," he said. "Fast." Lyra looked toward the armored viewport at the far side of the bay. Beyond it, stars burned clean and distant, patient as winter. When she spoke, her voice lost what little formality remained and became something harder, stripped down to fact. The war front near the Helion Reach was manufactured. Raids were staged. Signals were altered. Evidence was planted to make it appear that the Union had violated border law. Ethan turned his head toward her. "You are saying someone started an interstellar war with forged paperwork and dead witnesses," Lyra said. "Yes." The doc seemed colder after that. Ethan had spent most of his adult life around machines because machines made sense. A pump failed for a reason. A hatch jammed because metal warped or dirt got where it should not. Human beings, and apparently aliens too, could break worlds for reasons much smaller and uglier. He looked back at the screen, at the routing data and the sealed record waiting for a destination it might never reach. "And if this gets out?" he asked. "Then the factions inside my father's court lose control of the military vote," Lyra said. "The mobilization collapses. The border fleets stand down. Millions live." She said it without drama. No performance. No royal polish. Just arithmetic. Ethan had heard farmers talk the same way about flood levels and lost acreage, plain numbers carrying lives inside them. He swallowed once and checked the pod diagnostics again, because thinking with his hands was easier than thinking with the shape of that sentence. Millions live. Pod 7 still held at 48% fuel. Its guidance was ugly but workable. Life support could carry 1 injured passenger for several hours, maybe more if the thermal shell did not crack. The launch rail, though, was another problem. A yellow fault line ran across the bottom of the screen. Magnetic ejection ring unstable. Manual release required. Ethan read it twice, as if the words might decide to become kinder. They did not. Lyra followed his gaze and understood immediately. "The release control is external," she said. "Yes. Then whoever launches the pod cannot be inside it." He did not answer at once. Somewhere beyond Bay 9, another tremor passed through Talon Station, low and deep, making the hanging restraint straps sway like pendulums. Dust drifted from the ceiling seam in a soft gray veil. Ethan stared at the fault warning, then at the pod, then at the narrow launch tube beyond the armored shutter where open space waited without mercy or opinion. He could feel the decision forming before he let himself name it. Lyra saw it on his face and stepped closer. "No," she said, too quickly, too sharply. "Do not decide anything yet." Ethan let out a small breath that almost became a laugh. "That is usually the moment when people have already decided. I am telling you not to. And I am telling you the system wants a warm body on the outside switch." He turned from the console and crossed to the launch housing, kneeling beside the access plate near the rail. The manual lever assembly sat behind a protective shield held in place by 4 stubborn bolts and 1 cracked seal. Of course it did. He set his wrench against the first bolt and started turning. Lyra stood motionless for half a second, then moved to him, lowering herself with visible effort to the deck beside the housing. "Ethan," she said, and this time his name sounded different in her voice. Not like a tool she had reluctantly chosen to use. Like a person. "You do not understand what they will do if they find you here." He cracked the second bolt loose and looked at her at last. His eyes were tired. Blue-gray in the bad light. Steady in a way that made fear feel almost impolite. "No," he said. "I understand exactly enough. That is the problem." And as the plate came free beneath his hands, Talon Station gave another long wounded groan, as if even the steel around them knew there was only one honest way this was going to end. Some choices did not sound heroic when they were made. They sounded like metal threads giving way under a wrench, like a cracked relay clicking into place, like one tired man breathing through his nose and deciding there was no point pretending the numbers meant anything else. Ethan pulled the access plate clear and set it aside on the deck. Behind it sat the manual release assembly for Pod 7, old mechanical design backed by newer failsafes that had already burned themselves useless. A red handle. A pressure lock. One external ignition switch protected by a clear shield gone cloudy with age. He had seen simpler farm equipment in Iowa with Kinder Engineering. "How long?" Lyra asked. Ethan leaned in, reading the faded instruction strip with the sort of concentration other men reserved for prayer. "Once the pod seals and the rail charges, maybe 12 seconds before manual ignition," he said. "Maybe less if the capacitors hold. And after ignition? The launch tube will vent hard. The outer bay door will cycle. Anybody standing here when it goes will not be taking the scenic route out." He said it plainly, almost gently, as if softening the truth would only insult it. Lyra took one step toward him. Then another. The pain in her leg showed now in the careful set of her shoulders, in the slight delay before each movement landed. Still, she came. There must be another way. Ethan looked up from the housing. He had heard that sentence before, from stranded crews and busted captains and once from his own mother in a hospital hallway 12 years earlier. Sometimes there was another way. Sometimes there was only the part where people kept talking because silence would make the truth too real. "I checked the board," he said. "Mag ring is unstable. Guidance is partial. Life support is enough for one passenger if the system does not waste reserve heating empty cabin volume. This pod leaves light or it does not leave at all." Lyra's eyes did not leave his face. The station around them breathed in failing rhythms, panels ticking as they cooled, somewhere far off a door trying and failing to seal. "Then I remain," she said. "You send the records." Ethan actually laughed at that, one short dry sound with no humor in it. "Lady, I can barely get your pod out of the bay. You want me to walk diplomatic proof of an interstellar conspiracy into a council chamber by myself? You are harder to predict than most trained envoys. That is not the compliment you think it is." He rose, wiped his hand on his pant leg, and crossed to the pod. The cabin hatch stood open under the amber wash of low backup power. Inside, the crash webbing waited, one restraint twisted, one overhead display flickering weak telemetry. Ethan reached up, tugged the harness straight, then turned back to her. "Get in." Lyra did not move. The silver at her collar caught the light in a thin dull line. "I can order fleets," she said softly. "I can dissolve treaties. I can condemn houses older than your species' first cities. But I cannot command you, can I?" Ethan held her gaze. For a moment the station seemed to narrow around them until there was only the cold air, the smell of old wiring, and the distance between one stubborn human and one alien who had spent her life being obeyed. "No," he said. "You cannot." Something in her face gave way then. Not dignity. Never that. Something lonelier. The part built from certainty. She stepped toward the pod without taking her eyes off him. Ethan helped her up the short boarding rail, one steady hand under her elbow, careful and efficient, the way he would have handled damaged equipment that still mattered. Only this mattered more. When she lowered herself into the seat, she winced once and then went still, spine straight despite the pain. Ethan fastened the restraints across her shoulders and waist, checking each lock by touch. His hands were rough and warm and unshaking. Lyra watched him as though trying to memorize a language she had mocked until the moment she needed it to save her life. "Ethan," she said when he reached for the hatch. He paused. "When this reaches the council, your name will be spoken in every chamber that matters." He looked at her, then at the data module glowing on the console beside her seat, then back at her again. "That is not why I am doing it." "I know," Lyra said. Her voice had gone very quiet. "That is why they will listen." The words stayed between them for one heartbeat, maybe two. Then the station shuddered so violently that the lights cut out altogether. Darkness swallowed the bay. For half a second there was only the thin silver of starlight through the viewport and the pale outline of Ethan's face. Backup power returned in a hard amber pulse. Somewhere outside Bay 9, a new sound rose through the failing corridors. Not an alarm. Not machinery. Footsteps. More than one. Measured. Closing. Ethan heard them and did not turn his head right away. He only lowered the hatch until the seal caught at the first lock and said, almost under his breath, "That sounds like my cue." The pod hatch sealed with a soft mechanical pull that sounded far too gentle for a moment like that. Ethan spun the final latch, slapped the manual lock twice to make sure it held, and stepped back as amber indicators crawled across the edge of the frame one light at a time. Pressurization held. Cabin seal green. Guidance partial. External release required. Lyra could see him through the curved glass now with a clarity that felt cruel. He stood just beyond the reflection of her own face, shoulders squared, shirt darkened with sweat and dust, one hand still resting on the hatch as if he were making certain she stayed real for 1 second longer. Then the footsteps reached Bay 9. They came from the corridor in measured rhythm, not rushed, not uncertain, the sound of people arriving to finish work they believed was already done. Ethan turned toward the half-jammed blast door and every line in him changed. He did not become larger. He became simpler. A man with no extra motion left in him. He crossed the deck. In 6 quick steps, grabbed the cargo case lodged in the door track, and threw his weight against it. The crate shifted an inch, then another, metal grinding against metal with a shriek that cut through the bay. The narrowed opening pulled tighter. Not sealed, but tighter. Enough to slow whoever came next. Lyra struck the inside of the pod glass with her palm. "Ethan." He looked back at her once. Just once. The amber light from the launch console caught the side of his face and the pale color of his eyes. He raised one finger in a small weight gesture, almost absurdly calm, then dropped to one knee beside the exposed launch housing and yanked the clear shield off the ignition assembly. The shield skittered across the deck and vanished under the pod rail. A warning tone filled the bay, low and continuous now, like the station itself had finally stopped pretending it could survive. Through the forward viewport of the pod, Lyra could see the outer launch shutter beginning to cycle. Not opening yet. Only preparing. Hydraulic clamps released in stages. Frost ran along the inner edge of the tube. Beyond it, space waited in a long black line threaded with distant stars. Ethan gripped the red release handle and pulled. Nothing. He reset his stance, planted both boots, and pulled again harder. This time the mechanism answered with a deep locking thud that rolled through the rail beneath her seat. Pod 7 woke around her. The cabin vibrated. The overhead display cleared 3 lines of fault text and replaced them with a single command string in cold white letters. Launch sequence armed. Lyra's breath caught. The footsteps in the corridor stopped. For one suspended second, Bay 9 went almost perfectly still. Then shadows crossed the narrow opening at the blast door. Ethan did not wait to see faces. He hit the ignition shield switch with the heel of his hand, and the launch rail screamed alive. Blue-white charge spilled down the magnetic track in a line so bright it burned itself across the pod glass. The whole cabin lurched as the cradle locked around her. Through the storm of reflected light, Lyra saw Ethan turn sideways between the launch housing and the damaged bay door, placing his body in the only gap left between her and whatever had come through that corridor. He was not holding a rifle. Not wearing armor. Just a maintenance man with a wrench still hanging from one hand and the station's red emergency light painting his shoulders like fire. The outer shutter split open. Hard vacuum took the sound from the room in a single savage breath, and everything that followed happened in silence. The pod shot forward down the tube with a force that crushed Lyra against the restraints. Talon Station vanished, then reappeared in fragments through the rear camera feed. Bay 9 became a rectangle of light and shadow. Ethan stood in it for one impossible instant, backlit by failing systems and cold stars, one human shape holding the line while the pod burned into open dark. Then distance took him. The camera switched automatically to exterior telemetry. The station turned beneath her in slow wounded rotation, every damaged panel reflecting starlight in broken strips. A notification blinked across the lower corner of her display. Observatory array active. Collision tracking engaged. Multi-angle optical archive preserved. Lyra stared at the words through tears she did not understand until she felt them cooling on her skin. Talon Station's astronomical sensors, designed to log debris fields and map distant bodies, had been recording the launch tube, the bay, the corridor, all of it. Not just one feed. Every feed. Every angle. Every second. The station was dying, but its eyes were still open. Ethan's last stand had not vanished into smoke and failing lights. The stars themselves, through steel and lens and silent vacuum, had witnessed him. And somewhere behind her, growing smaller with every mile, a human being remained inside the dark because he had decided that one life, and everything it carried, had to make it out. By the time Pod 7 reached the outer patrol lane, its fuel reserve had dropped to 31% and the guidance system had started compensating in ugly, shuddering bursts that made the stars jump across the forward glass. Lyra barely noticed. She sat rigid beneath the crash webbing, one hand pressed against the edge of the console where the archived optical files from Talon Station still glowed in a quiet column of white text. She had replayed the final exterior frame only once. That had been enough. A human silhouette in the broken mouth of Bay 9. Red light. Cold stars. One impossible act of mercy held still in the middle of mechanical ruin. After that, she left the file closed, not because she feared it, but because some truths became heavier when watched too often. The patrol frigate that found her belonged to the neutral convoy lanes near the Helion Reach, a lean Union vessel with old engines and honest hull scoring. They brought her aboard under emergency protocol, sealed the pod behind her, and stared when her identity cleared. An heir of the Accord line did not usually arrive alone in a damaged escape capsule carrying sovereign-grade evidence and the silence of someone who had left part of herself somewhere behind the stars. From there, events moved with the cold speed of systems larger than grief. Medics stabilized her. Cipher teams verified the message chain. 3 governments denied everything before the first archive had even finished copying. Then the council chamber opened. It was older than most fleets and built to make every voice sound smaller than law. Rings of black stone rose in widening tiers beneath a vaulted ceiling where constellations had been set in silver long before Ethan Cross was born in Cedar Falls, Iowa, and learned to fix broken things because someone had to. Delegates filled the chamber in uniforms, robes, pressure collars, ceremonial medals, and polished calm. Some of them knew Lyra by name. Some knew her by bloodline. A few had likely expected her never to arrive. She walked past all of them with a slight limp she refused to hide and placed the recovered data core in the center well herself. When the evidence concluded, the room did not erupt. There was no shouting. No theatrical outrage. The forged orders, the staged incursions, the false chain of command, all of it landed exactly as truth usually did when it finally reached a room built on power. First disbelief. Then recognition. Then silence. There is one record remaining, Lyra said, and her voice carried cleanly through the chamber without strain. She did not look up at the tiers. She looked at the projection field in front of her. It is not strategic. It is not diplomatic. But it is the reason any of you are hearing this at all. She touched the archive control. Talon Station appeared above the chamber in cold light, rendered from the observatory array that had watched its final minutes through steel, lens, and vacuum. Bay 9 came into focus. The damaged launch rail. The opening shutter. The pod leaving. And then Ethan. No rank markers. No ceremony. No speech. Just one white-skinned human mechanic standing where the danger was because someone else needed the path behind him. The angle changed. Then changed again. Corridor view. External hull reflection. Launch tube telemetry. The station had seen him from every eye it had left. No one moved while the recording played. When it ended, the projection field went dark, but the image seemed to remain anyway, printed somewhere behind every face in the room. Lyra stood very still. In that stillness, she finally understood what had made Ethan so difficult to measure. He had not acted like a hero because he had not needed the name. He had seen a life, a choice, a failing machine, and the narrow honest thing that had to be done. That was all. And somehow that was greater than all the titles in the chamber combined. She lifted her chin and spoke the final words without ornament, because ornament would have cheapened them. He was not of my blood. He was not of my house. He was not even of my world. But when fear ruled ours, the human chose mercy. Across the tiers, one delegate lowered his head. Then another. Then another. Metal insignias caught the chamber light and dipped toward the floor in a motion older than treaty language, older than politics, older maybe than civilization itself. Respect offered to the dead. Not because he had conquered. Because he had remained human when power would have preferred something easier. Above them, the silver constellations in the ceiling held their places, bright and remote and patient. For the first time in her life, Lyra Vale looked at a chamber full of empires and understood that the strongest thing she had ever seen had not